So my name is Sandra Reimer, and I work with Tour Imagination on their communication. This evening we have with us Audrey Roth-Petkow, the president of Tour Imagination. Tour Imagination is a travel company that started back in 1970 to help North American Anabaptists explore their heritage in Europe. We've expanded since that time, doing cultural excursions as well as natural wonders tours, and we have a variety of tours, including still wonderful heritage tours. Audrey, I'm going to turn over the evening to you so that you can introduce our special guest and kick off week 7.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome once again. I trust you all have been enjoying the webinars as much as I have on our series of The Anabaptist Story Lives On, virtual museum and archive tours. Tonight's presenter is Marnette D. Hofer. Marnette is the executive director and archivist at Heritage Hall Museum and Archives in Freeman, South Dakota. She began as archivist in 2015 and took on the executive director role about 3 years ago. Marnette is passionate about sharing the stories of those who have gone before us. She especially loves the connection between gathering and documenting the community's stories through the archives, and then the opportunity to celebrate and share those stories alongside the artifacts of the museum. Marnette and her husband Todd farm just north of Freeman and have 4 grown children and a grandson. Welcome, Marnette. We look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you, Audrey. Hello, everyone. So first off, I would like to thank Tour Imagination for spearheading this series. It has been wonderfully informative, and I think it has also brought us all an awareness of our shared roots that bind us together, even though our paths have been very different. Those paths have shaped us, not only in how we got to where we are today, but also in who we are today. So my goal this evening is to share some of the stories of the 3 Anabaptist groups whose paths led them here to South Dakota, and to illustrate those stories with some of the books and documents from our archives and artifacts that you can see when you come to visit our museum. So I am going to open up my PowerPoint here. Heritage Hall Museum and Archives is located in the southwest corner of Freeman, South Dakota, which is a town of about 1,300, nestled in the southeast corner of South Dakota. Our museum shares the stories, or the paths, if you will, of those who have lived in this place, including the 3 different Anabaptist groups, the Hutterites, the Low German Mennonites, and the Swiss-Volhynian Amish. Each group followed a different path to Russia in the mid to late 18th century, lived there for about 100 years, and then immigrated to America when their way of life was threatened by a czar who wanted to Russianize the country. The area around what is today Freeman, South Dakota is the only place where the paths of all 3 of these groups converged, as they settled alongside each other in the 1870s and eventually came to be a community. So when you look at the overall history of the Anabaptists in Europe, you see centuries of persecution and upheaval. The Anabaptists would be forced out of one area because of their religious views, would find refuge with a sympathetic landowner who saw them as good, industrious farmers and tenants. But then a generation or 2 later, they would once again be persecuted and forced to move on or to flee. And this is the shared history of all 3 of the Anabaptist groups in the Freeman community. I want to start by talking about the Hutterian Brethren, or simply the Hutterites. This group was a branch of the Anabaptist movement whose beliefs were based on a literal interpretation of the passages in Acts where Luke talks about the early church living communally, sharing their belongings, and taking care of each other. The movement took its name from Jacob Hutter, a very charismatic leader who was burned at the stake in 1536. Now, one of Hutter's contemporaries was Peter Riedemann, a Hutterite missionary. Riedemann was imprisoned on several occasions, and in the 1540s, he was a prisoner of Philip of Hesse at the castle of Wolkersdorf. Riedemann felt that it was important for Philip of Hesse to understand the beliefs that Hutterites practiced. So while he was in prison, he wrote his confession or accounting of his faith. This became known as the Rechenschaft, and it was and still is the basic doctrinal statement of the Hutterian Brethren. Riedemann's original manuscript is most likely lost, but there are 2 codices that still do exist. So one of the ways in which local authorities would harass the Hutterites was to go into their homes and confiscate their books and manuscripts. So one copy of the Rechenschaft is now in a primatial library in Hungary, but the other one was preserved by the Brethren, made its way to America, and is now on display here in our museum. We believe that this manuscript was copied and bound around 1770. Some of it seems to predate the Hutterites' move to Byshenka, Russia, but the last 40 pages or so appear to have been completed while they were living in Russia. It has the typical Hutterite bookbinding with brass trimming and clasps, and it is in pristine condition. Not that long after Peter Riedemann penned his manuscript, the Hutterian Brethren experienced a golden period that lasted about 30 years while they were living in Moravia. During that time, the movement grew rapidly. By the early 1600s, there were over 100 communities with an estimated population of between 20 and 30,000. They were engaged in a variety of economic activities, including pottery making, and we have a nice collection of replicas of their work. Their doctors were well respected in Europe, and it was during this golden period that they established the first kindergartens, 270 years before that was even a thing in Germany. But, like I said, these periods of peace would quickly fade, and numerous wars and constant persecution and upheaval took its toll. In fact, these people were so heavily persecuted that there came a time when they gave up community of goods, and by the 1770s, when they moved to Ukraine, their numbers were down to 60 people. They really struggled during those years, but eventually, the Hutterites came into contact with Johann Cornys, who was an important leader amongst the Low German Mennonites to the south. And he arranged for the Hutterites to come live near the Molochna colonies. He really helped them start over and move forward with their lives. And I find it interesting because you can see the Low German Mennonite influence on the Hutterites by some of the things they brought with them about 30 or 40 years later when they came to America. This trunk, of a style very common amongst the Low Germans, was brought over by the Johann Wipf family. Johann went on to be one of the founders of the Huttertal Mennonite Church near Freeman. This resting bench was said to have been built in Russia by Michael Hofer around 1881. This clock came with a Hutterite family but was made in 1868 by the Low German clockmaker Gerhard Mantler. Paths crossed and there were significant influences. In the 1870s, almost all of the Hutterites, about 1,250 people, immigrated to America and settled in Dakota Territory. Here, major decisions had to be made. About 1/3 of the Hutterites decided to once again live communally in colonies here in Dakota Territory. The others chose to live on individual farms on the prairies, so they were referred to as the Prairie Leute. Many of these chose to become Mennonites, and some became Mennonite Brethren. And yet, many had family members who still lived in the colonies, so their paths diverged. The Prairie Leute, or Hutters as they are known locally, became active and important members of the Freeman community. They were store owners, bankers, newspaper editors, teachers, and farmers. So, I want to go back now and talk about another of the Anabaptist groups that came to our area. The Anabaptist story in Northern Europe brings us the Low German Mennonites, named after one of their more influential leaders, Menno Simons. Simons was a Catholic priest who came to believe that the ultimate authority was the Bible rather than the established church. He was a prolific writer and a capable leader who organized and counseled the Dutch Mennonites, even amidst severe persecution. That persecution led the Low German Mennonites east to Poland, Prussia, and eventually to Russia and the Ukraine. The first Low German Mennonite settlement in Russia was in an area of northwestern Ukraine called Volhynia. But most of the Low German Mennonites eventually settled about 400 to 500 miles southeast in southern Ukraine, establishing the large and prosperous colonies of Gortytsa and Molochna. So one of the Low German books in our archives from this period in Russia is Tobias Unruh's baptismal record. Unruh was ordained as the elder of the Karlswalde parish of Volhynia in 1853, and in this book he records over 700 baptisms that he performed before his death in 1875. Unruh was also one of the 12 delegates that were chosen from the Anabaptist congregations in Russia after word got out that Tsar Alexander II wanted to Russianize the country and take away many of the privileges that the Anabaptist and other German-speaking settlers had enjoyed. Unruh represented the Volhynian Low Germans, while other delegates represented the Molochna and Bergtal colonies, the Kleine Gemeinde, those in West Prussia, the Hutterites, and the Swiss-Volhynian Amish. The delegates traveled to New York City in the spring of 1873, and then they split into smaller groups, crisscrossing North America in search of a new home for their people. I have to give a shout out to Rod Ratzlaff for compiling this map from Unruh's diary of the time. And I should also note that we have two other delegates' diaries in our archives, written by Paul Cheddar of the Hutterites and Andreas Schrag from the Swiss-Volhynians. What I think is fascinating, though, is that before the delegates returned to Russia, 3 of them managed to arrange a private meeting with President Ulysses S. Grant at his summer home, his cottage by the sea on Long Island. Unruh and the Hutterite delegates, Paul and Lorenz Cheddar, met with Grant, with J. Cook of the Northern Pacific Railroad acting as their interpreter. The delegates hoped to obtain a block of land for the Anabaptist groups to settle on, and they also wanted assurance that they could live in peace and not be called to fight in any wars. Grant assured the delegates that although he couldn't designate land for the Anabaptists, there was plenty of land available. And he said the US Constitution guarantees religious freedom, and the US just got through the Civil War not a decade prior, so he didn't believe there was any threat of war for quite some time. Excuse me. Needless to say, despite the lack of guarantees, many of the Anabaptists living in Russia were ready to leave, and there were many who traveled to America during the remainder of the 1870s. Only about 1/3 of the Low German Mennonites in Russia came to North America at that time. And those who came were from different areas of Russia, and they settled in different communities here. Unruh was the only elder to settle in Dakota Territory, and he died already in 1875, leaving the Low German groups here in Dakota with no clear leader. They did attempt to unite into one church, but the effort failed. And so the Low German Mennonites were never a very cohesive group here in South Dakota. Several Mennonite churches were built, some became Mennonite Brethren, but others left and joined the Seventh-day Adventists, so their paths diverged. And in all fairness, there was a lot to adjust to here in Dakota Territory. The immigrants could not settle in villages like they had in Russia. Instead, thanks to Abraham Lincoln's Homestead Act of 1862, the settlers could file for a homestead claim of 160 acres. But that left them so much more isolated than they were used to. Then during their first years in America, the Dakota settlers dealt with prairie fires, and plagues of grasshoppers, both leaving total destruction in their wake. And overzealous land agents never mentioned the harsh winters on the treeless plains. These are just some of the reasons that this pioneer home, preserved here at the museum, is so precious. This house was built by Low German Mennonite Ludwig Deckert around 1879. The lumber had to be brought in by train, as there were very few trees here at the time. But Ludwig was a master carpenter, and his handiwork still stands tall today, built to last. The home has a layout quite typical of what the Black Sea Germans in Russia were fond of, with a central black kitchen for preparing and cooking food, and a distinctive furnace or bake oven known as a Russian oven, with which one could heat the entire house all day with just an armful of tall prairie grass. And upstairs, there is a massive beehive smokehouse chimney with plenty of room to smoke their sausages, wild game, and much more. When it was still a new home, it was threatened as a prairie fire rolled through the area. All hands set to work trying to avert the looming flames, but Ludwig's wife, Susanna, had stayed at the house. And when a stray ember blew onto the east side of her new home, Susanna used the only liquid she had nearby. She grabbed her coffee pot and doused the errant flame. In the end, the Deckert family was very lucky. On the day after the big fire, a neighbor said he counted 17 of those big adobe chimneys left standing bare and alone, as a wide swath of neighbors lost their homes. Despite all this, the Low German Mennonites became active and important members of the greater Freeman community. They were builders, blacksmiths, farmers, chiropractors, and educators. So the last of the 3 Anabaptist groups that I want to talk about this evening are the Swiss-Volhynian Amish. The Anabaptists in Switzerland were known as the Swiss Brethren. Then there was a rift between 2 leaders, Hans Reist and Jacob Amann, which led to the division of 1693. Many of the Swiss in the Freeman community, known locally as the Schweitzers, are descendants of those who followed Jacob Amann and became known as Amish. Whereas persecution of the Anabaptists in the Netherlands lasted only a few decades, the Anabaptists in Switzerland were persecuted into the 19th century. So there were numerous waves of Anabaptists who left Switzerland. Some, of course, came to America, while our forefathers went to the Alsace and to the Palatinate. Eventually, these groups of Swiss Amish reunited in Ukraine, in eastern Volhynia. But all along the way, their leaders continued to be in touch with those back in southern Germany who began holding conferences and sending out Ordnungsbriefe, which were a collection or constitution of what the Amish believed and how they should live. In our archives, we have one of the Ordnungsbriefe from 1779 that was signed by a Jacob Graber who was living in Mickelsdorf, Poland at the time. So by the 1870s, the Swiss-Volhynian congregations were also looking to leave Russia. Their delegate to America was Andreas Strag. He and Jacob Stuckey were 2 of the leaders who brought almost all of the Swiss-Volhynians, about 1,000 people, to the Great Plains states. Strag and the first 3 groups settled in this area of Dakota Territory, while Stuckey and the Kottasufka group settled in Kansas. And for some years after, there was some shifting as some from Kansas came to live in South Dakota and some from South Dakota went to live in Kansas. Again, the crisscrossing paths I talked of earlier. I think it is important to note, though, that none of the Anabaptist groups I've spoken of came to America on their own. They all received help from Anabaptist congregations already in America. There were a lot of expenses involved with immigrating, and these people left as whole villages So it's not like they were getting top dollar for their homes. Tobias Unruh sought loans of about $40,000 from congregations in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and Ontario to aid the Low German Volhynians in their trek. And Andreas Schrag arranged for aid from the Mennonite Board of Guardians to help several families get to Dakota Territory. Later appeals were made to the Mennonite Executive Aid Committee in Pennsylvania, who actually sent representatives to Dakota. They were very moved by what they found. Many of the immigrants had arrived too late in the year to plant crops, and prairie fires had destroyed what food they had for either humans or animals. So the committee representatives from Pennsylvania decided that in order to keep the people from starving to death, they would buy 1,000 sacks of flour to be distributed amongst all 3 of these Anabaptist groups. One of the committee members later reported in Der Mennonitische Friedensbote of his visit to Dakota, and I quote, "We visited many brothers. They were happy to see us. They showed us all the love they could. Almost in every place we came to, we were surrounded by the brothers who bade us to help them. They said the winter was at hand and they couldn't get any work to earn money to buy bread for themselves and their children. They live very simply. They seem to be happy when they have bread and coffee. Their main plea is for bread. In spite of all their difficult beginnings and sorrowful lot, we met no one who wished himself back in Russia. They seem to be happy when they can live in a land where they have freedom of conscience." Unfortunately, things didn't exactly get better from there. In 1877, Andreas Schrag and Joseph Graber traveled to the East to ask for financial contributions. When they returned, they purchased flour for the settlers with the money they'd been given. They also received a substantial amount from individuals in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and notes like this were prepared for each family in Dakota that received money. Careful records were kept, and the money was slowly paid back with 6% interest. Some folks took longer to repay their loans than others, and sometimes those who had loaned the money just forgave it. During those first years in America, the Swiss Amish congregations in both South Dakota and Kansas regularly sent representatives to the Amish ministers' meetings held out east. But the association had loosened somewhat, and slowly the Swiss-Volhynians of East Freeman began to lean more and more to being simply Mennonite. In 1880, the Herodish congregation built their first church with the help of a loan from an individual in Pennsylvania. This model from our museum collection shows the building both inside and out. The church was known as Salem's Kirche. It later merged with the Zion congregation and today is known as the Salem Zion Mennonite Church. And the people persevered. The Swiss-Volhynian Amish, now Mennonites, became active and important members of the Greater Freeman community. They were musicians, doctors, teachers, book printers, and farmers. Together, the Hutterites, Low German Mennonites, and Swiss-Volhynian Amish became a community. In the late 1800s, together they started a city church in Freeman. Then in 1900, together they began South Dakota Mennonite College, which over time became known as Freeman Junior College and Academy, and today continues on as Freeman Academy. These joint efforts, especially the school, began to tear down the walls between these groups, minimizing their differences and accentuating the positives that could happen when the groups worked together. In the late 1950s, the ladies of the Freeman College Auxiliary began a fundraiser called Schmeckfest that was simply a tasting festival featuring foods from each of the 3 Anabaptist traditions. The festival has grown and changed, but it continues today as a celebration of this community's Anabaptist heritage. And now my story comes full circle. Our museum collection started as a simple collection of rocks and minerals donated to South Dakota Mennonite College back in 1911. That was the genesis of the large and varied collection that exists here today. Over the years, various individuals have stepped forward to ensure that this collection was cared for and that it represented this community. In the 1970s, the collection was moved to its current location, and now with over 25,000 square feet of displays, we have a lot to share. Our archives has some amazing treasures and resources, and yet, in many ways, we feel like we are just beginning as we work to tell the stories of the people and the places and the paths that have led them all here to this time and to this place, and that have shaped us into who we are today. So with that, I want to close and perhaps try to answer any questions. Thank you so much for listening.
That's great. Thank you, Marnette. Very informative. We have several questions. People are very curious here. Verna is wondering, looks like the Mennonite Board of Guardians helped Mennonites come to the Dakota Territory. Did the same organization also help the Mennonites who went to Cottonwood County, Minnesota? Do you happen to know that?
I have no idea.
Not sure. Okay.
But somebody over in Cottonwood County might know.
Strong possibility. Okay, Doreen is wondering, on what basis are you calling Mennonites from the Malachna Low German Mennonites?
That is what they were.
I think they're often called Russian Mennonites, but if I'm understanding correctly, it's because they're from where they originated, right? From
right. The German Mennonites would simply refer to the fact that originally they were from the lowlands of Germany and Northern Europe there, but they did indeed end up in Russia for a longer time than our people. The people around here wouldn't consider themselves Russian Mennonites. That's pretty exclusive to those who stayed after those initial migrations in the 1870s.
Great, that's good to understand that. And I'm curious whether your holdings tell any stories about interactions between Anabaptists and the indigenous peoples of the Dakotas. That's from Christina.
We do. We have a nice collection of artifacts from this area. The Yankton Sioux, you know, were here in the Dakotas before we were. So that's been pretty important to pay homage to the fact that we weren't the first ones in this area. So yes, we have a collection. One of the things that I probably appreciate the most, there's a quilt that was given actually fairly recently, because there have been groups in both communities, the Native American community that's a ways west here, and then our community, that have met together, and they gave us a quilt that now hangs in our museum. So yes, we are trying to acknowledge that part of this area's history.
That's great. Alan Peters is saying, many so-called Low German Mennonites never went to Russia, but came to North America directly from Prussia, Poland, so it is necessary to clump these two related groups together. And so the Low German Mennonites refers to both. He makes a point to the earlier question.
Right.
Jean is wondering, did the folk arts of these groups, such as fracture, resemble those of the Pennsylvania Anabaptists? Do you know?
You know, I really toyed with showing some of those sort of items. The Low German Mennonites, they, especially in the Malachna, in those southern Ukraine colonies, that was a part of their teaching. They would teach the beautiful, beautiful writing, and it was gorgeous. we have one of the trunks that came with a Low German family is adorned on the inside with some of these beautiful Proctor artwork and such. And there are a number of books, textbooks and stuff, you know, where people practice writing and such that have that. And there is also evidence of that amongst Hutterite writings. And I have to wonder if it was that time period when they were living so closely, or maybe that was, it's a whole area I would love to explore further. Is it as special a thing as some of the Proctor that I've seen in Pennsylvania? No, I don't think it was ever. The examples we have are not that special. I struggle with that, and I've struggled with whether that is, you know, really the same thing or not. I mean, the Pennsylvania Dutch made it into an artwork, and here it was much more something that was taught, that was practiced, but it was never, you know, monetized and yeah, done quite in the same way. But it is an interesting thing that I would love to explore further.
Nice. I've always been taught that Mennonites did not believe in charging interest on loans. Any idea then why these relief loans were charged interest?
Very good question. Could we just turn the clock back 140 years? That's a good point.
So you're not sure, you haven't heard why?
No.
Okay. Gary says, great story. I visited a Hutterite colony in North Dakota. Is it possible to visit a colony near Freeman?
Yes, absolutely. We have I mean, there's, you know, there's a number of colonies right close, and a lot of them do allow outsiders and do tours and such, or allow tours, yeah.
Great. Doreen is wondering, do any of the current residents of Freeman still speak the languages they spoke when they first migrated to Freeman from Europe? If so, which ones?
Yes. Several years ago, I did a project where I had a group come in with microphones and professional equipment to record some of the local dialect speakers. And I was able to get groups from each of the Anabaptist groups. The Hutterites, people with the Hutterish background, you know, they can practice because the Hutterite colonies are right here and they're still speaking. Obviously, it's changed a little over the years, but that language, that dialect, still is quite healthy. The Low Germans, of course, there are many Low Germans all over the world that are still speaking Low German. So I don't fear that dialect is going to die.
Right.
The Schweitzer dialect, as we call it here, that one's tougher. The people that still speak that are older, and there is no outside group that is speaking that anymore. Right. So for a long time, we did programs. We'd go down to Bethel College in Kansas, would host programs, and there'd be people from Kansas that were speaking the Schweitzer dialect, as well as some from up here. I'm not sure that those happen anymore. And yeah, that's starting to dwindle, which is really, really sad. And I should point out too that when we talk about Schweitzer dialect, that's not Swiss. There were people in this community that spoke Swiss into the 1920s. Only a few families though. The Schweitzer dialect that we refer to is actually what they picked up when they were in the Palatinate. And so it would be very similar to Pennsylvania Dutch. But of course, everybody has had a different route, a different path. So it's a little different too.
Okay.
Long answer, sorry.
That's okay. Rhonda is wondering, she said at the beginning of the presentation, you spoke of two men. Was one of them Wiederman or Wiederman? This is a name from my husband's family.
With a W?
Yeah.
No, I have seen that name, yes, in the Hutterite history. No, this was a Riedemann with an R.
Oh, with an R. Okay.
Mhm.
Good. Thank you for clarifying. Someone's wondering, can you talk about Daniel Unruh on the map, the first Mennonite settlement map that you showed?
Daniel Unruh came independently of all the others. He was actually living more in the Crimea area, and he came already in 1873. So when the 12 delegates were crisscrossing North America searching for a place, he was already on the way. And so in the fall of 1873, he settled, southeast here of Freeman, and he brought, he was one of the first to leave, and so you could sell your belongings there and do quite well. These others who came later, there weren't many people to sell those things to anymore, so they didn't come with as many funds. He was a much wealthier person, and got a lot of land, established very well.
The benefit of being an early adopter, I guess, a pioneer.
Yeah, and we, there is some speculation that it is because he was here in Dakota Territory that is why the other groups came here. Each of these groups, when they were immigrating, they were in constant communication with, like, John S. Funk over in Elkhart, Indiana. He is actually one who went with the 12 delegates that summer and helped them, find places. And so Unruh was also in communication with him. So it is very possible that, through him, the rest of them found out about this part of Dakota Territory and came. We don't really know for sure. There are conflicting reports on that.
Oh. Let's see. My Herman and Marlies Stahl, or my great-grandfather, Paul Stahl, was one of the few Hutterites who stayed in Russia in 1870s. He was in love with a Mennonite young woman. Are there still family names like Stahl and Wipf in the area, in your area?
Yeah, very common names in this area and in the Hutterite colonies as well.
And Dawn is wondering, we have many Hutterite colonies here in Alberta. Do you have any information regarding the connection relationship between the Dakota Hutterites and those who live in Alberta or elsewhere in Canada?
So the Hutterite colonies, that slide probably went by pretty fast, but there were 3 colonies established here in Dakota Territory when the Hutterites came. Bonham Colony, which is down along the Missouri River near Yankton, that has always been there. It has stayed, those people have stayed. The other 2 colonies that were begun, the Wolf Creek and Old Elm Spring colonies, during World War I, when tensions got so bad here and being German was not exactly a good thing, and certainly speaking German as your main language was not a good thing. These pacifist Mennonites and Hutterites were in a quandary. So those 2 colonies moved en masse to Canada. Some also ended up going to Montana. That's the short answer.
Herman has a follow-up question about the Stahl Wipf names. Do any of these Hutterite colonies in the area have a concentration of these names? Do you happen to know?
I have directories in the archives.
Okay.
It could be searched.
Okay. And are your archives online?
Common names.
Okay.
Hofer is another one, very common.
That's good. And Kyle is wondering, what is the current economic producer of the Freeman area? What are the main agricultural crops, products?
Freeman area is very agriculturally based. Most of our, the businesses are related to ag. Farmers around here are planting predominantly corn and soybeans. You'll see, wheat fields and other such things, alfalfa, of course. And then, of course, livestock. But more and more, in the early part of, the 1900s, you were talking of a small, very diversified farm with, pigs and cows and crops and all sorts of things, and even up to a decade or two ago, you still saw several dairies and such. Now it has really gone to big ag. There's a few big players in the livestock arena, still cattle people, but it's tougher that way. And of course, with some of the craziness of the weather in the recent years, ag economy has struggled, and it is a concern, especially for small communities like this. We're lucky we are in a triangle here between Sioux Falls, Yankton, and Mitchell, which are some of the bigger cities in South Dakota, but challenging times.
Thank you. And I think that is most of our questions. Well, if anybody else has a final question, you can put it in the chat or in the Q&A. And Marnette, do you want to talk at all about your husband's first cousin's heritage tour that he's doing next summer?
Right. Rodney Hofer, if anybody is interested in following up on that Hutterite story, Rodney Hofer grew up in this community, and he has an amazing knowledge. He's kind of focused in on the history of the Hutterites when they were in Romania, just before they went into Russia. He has an amazing depth of knowledge of this, and he put together a tour last fall during harvest. I told him that was not a good time for farmers. So he's doing another one next June. And yeah, if anybody's interested in that sort of thing, Tour Imagination is coordinating that. So it would be great, a great opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have some of our set heritage tours and other types of tours, but then other times people with a passion on a particular topic or a place they want to visit, they'll approach Tour Imagination and say, hey, look, I'd like to lead this kind of tour. Would you work with me on it? And that was the case with Rod. And we thought, okay, let's see how this goes. We've never done or haven't in recent years done a Hutterite tour. And he's so passionate. And yeah, he just made it work. And he was constantly promoting it and getting people interested. And he's very knowledgeable and just seems very personable. And it's enjoyable to listen to the stories of someone who's so passionate about the topic.
And it's a fascinating period in their history. Yeah. Yeah,
it includes a hair-raising escape at night through the Transylvania mountains. So you'll be able to hear all about that, and imprisonments near, escapes and all kinds of stuff like that. So
there was a lot of drama with those early Anabaptists.
Lots of drama. That's great. So are there any final questions? Otherwise, Marlene is asking, tell us about the poster behind you and the film that was made. A little prompt there for you.
Yeah, right. In probably 2016 already, we started, I started visiting with some of the local historians, one from each of these groups. I was fairly new at the archives, and my background is Swiss, so I know the Schweitzer story very well. Obviously, I married a Hutter, so I have learned that story as well. I am not as familiar with the Low German story, so I decided to get experts from each of these groups together with the goal of putting a program together and educating other people, because I felt like, you know, a lot of people knew their own story, but they didn't understand how these three all work together. The stories come together so well. So we did a few programs and eventually hooked up with the Goshen College 5 Core Media. And they came out and spent several days on site. We went to the Bonham colony down by the river. We went to a number of old cemeteries here and such, and did quite a bit of filming, even did a little bit of reenacting, kind of. And yeah, it's an 80-minute video that we put together. We've been doing it as a DVD and a Blu-ray disc in one set, and sell them through our museum, kind of an ongoing fundraiser for us, since this is our story. This is this community's story. So yeah, if anybody's interested, there's a link on the website to get either an actual copy or else do a download copy. So
okay, you can download it as well.
Yeah.
Excellent. I do see one last question here from Lyle. How did the Mennonites end up in Freeman instead of Menno, South Dakota, which is close to Freeman?
Yeah, you know, that's another one where there's conflicting stories. The one I probably believe the most is there was a businessman in this town just to the southwest with the last name of Freeman. And of course, there were a lot of Mennonites living around Freeman, also down toward that town to the south. And the railroad guys, when they were coming through, you know, they basically established these towns, and they threw off the signs, and supposedly they mixed the signs up. So the town to the south should have been Freeman. This should have been Menno because of all the Mennonites, but it got mixed up.
Interesting.
Yeah, a little bit of a rub even today.
Oh, that's a fun story. Oh, and Alan, sounds like he has some personal knowledge of you, Alan Peters. Marnette does have some Hutterite Waldner ancestry, so she brings Swiss and Hutterite ancestries together.
That's right. This is true. I definitely need to acknowledge that. Yeah, and the whole Waltner story is a whole nother one. That's on the video though, so.
Oh, excellent. Super. So we will be sending out the link to the recording from this, along with links from the website, the Heritage Hall Museum and Archives website, and an opportunity for you to donate. And I'll throw in a link about the film as well. So if you've enjoyed the presentation this evening and you'd like to bless the Heritage Hall with a gift, I'm sure Marnette would be pleased.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. We appreciate you taking the time, Marnette, and many people in the comments are thanking you and saying what a great job you did. So
thank you for the
opportunity. You're welcome. Thank you everyone for coming. We have one last presentation next week and then it's all over. Have a good evening. Bye now.